Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for June 21, 2022, the Red Flags for Forced Labor edition. We begin with that story as red flags for forced labor were found in China's car battery supply chain. Ties to potentially coercive labor practices could prove a problem for an industry that is heavily dependent on China once the Uyghur anti-slavery law goes into effect, and that's this week. So, potentially a very troubling situation and difficult situation for battery makers because, remember, they have to affirmatively prove no forced labor in their supply chain, and we tie that to a story from the BBC, which is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act goes into effect next Tuesday. Imports from China's Xinjiang region are due to be banned from the U.S. as new rules come into effect. That's actually today, not next week. And under regulations, firms will have to prove imports from the region are not produced using forced labor. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult and indeed problematic. Next up, what are Scope 4 emissions? Well, we've had Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3. Well, now PG&E has come up with Scope 4. And Scope 4 is defined by PG&E as an emerging term for categorizing emission risks enabled by a company. So for PG&E, a utility that provides gas and electric service to Californians, have programs to enable their customers to reduce their carbon footprint and our Scope 4 goals. So if you weren't confused before, perhaps you will be now, although they seem to be synonymous with a term others use, avoided emissions. And our final story comes to us from also from the New York Times. And internal challenges such as corruption pose challenges to Ukraine's bid to join the EU. A cornerstone of President Zelensky's foreign policy is to get Ukraine into the EU, the European Union. The majority of Ukrainians and countries elite certainly favor it. But sympathy for Ukraine, although is high, it's going to require a crackdown on corruption. Ukraine was generally recognized, at least before President Zelensky came on board, as one of the most corrupt countries in the Eurasia region. And the EU certainly does not want to bring that into the vaunted EU. So it's going to be interesting to see if Ukraine can clean up its image of corruption and move that part of its agenda to EU membership as well. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.